Hello everybody, time for chapter 19, The Cutthroat Nuns. We lived about 3 miles from the nearest town, but the passage, as we called it, from the road to our home was another half a mile. On each side of the passage from the gateway were high mossy ditches where birds and rabbits nestled, and further down were 7 gates marking the divisions between the fields, as this was also the access lane for the cattle and machinery going along the farm. Lorry drivers dreaded our farm, and one cranky individual once poked his head out of his cab at my father and demanded, "Does the God Almighty know that people live down here?" I loved walking down that laneway, and I knew every twig and branch along the way. The first time that the joy of returning home along it hit me was after my first enforced absence from home, when I had to go into hospital in Cork for a week to have my tonsils removed. The prospect had not worried me greatly to begin with. However, when I saw my mother's hat disappearing out the hospital gate, I began to feel abandoned, and the week that followed was to put me off hospitals and nuns for the rest of my life. The nuns in their virginal white habits sailed around the wards like billowing swans, and when the operation left my throat feeling as if the French guillotine had done a job on it, I discovered that their snowy white exterior penetrated to their inner regions as well, for the nuns treated us with cool efficiency, but with very little of the milk of human kindness. I do not think that they believed in the approach expressed in "Suffer little children to come unto me." At home, whenever one of us had a sore throat, my mother soaked bread in warm milk, and this remedy slid down a raw throat like soft butter. Now, in hospital, my throat screamed in agony with every swallow, and my stomach groaned because its food supply was cut off. I thought with longing of my mother's solution. We called it goody, a childish word, and, like most children's expressions, an apt description. But when I asked one of the nuns if she had ever heard of goody, she threw back her head, gave a braying laugh like our Janet when he had been tied up for too long, and, looking around the ward, she asked in a high nasal voice, "Did any of you ever hear of goody?" She pronounced it as if it were a dirty word, and I wished that I could use some of my father's favourite phrases to tell her what I thought of her. The week in that hospital was a bewildering experience. The babies in the ward cried all the time they were awake. It was the era of restricted visiting, and the children cried from loneliness. At home on the farm, we cuddled our baby animals when they were sick. Here in the hospital, these children fared far worse, and it was heartbreaking to see the little tear-stained faces peering through the iron bars of the cots. After a few days, when I had begun to recover and to get my bearings, I began to plan my escape. Nobody, I decided, could survive in this setup for very long. Across the road from the hospital was a hotel. I sat on the veranda outside the children's ward and watched the comings and goings at the hotel, hoping to see a familiar face, and finally I spotted an old friend of my father's. The next day, I watched my chance to make my way out of the front door of the hospital, and I shouted across at Jack when he appeared. I poured out my troubles to him and discovered that he was going home by bus that evening. I asked him to call for me on his way to the bus. Then I went back to the nuns and told him that my father was collecting me that evening. Eventually, they relented and agreed to let me go. I felt like somebody released from jail after serving a sentence of hard labour. As we travelled to Lishnashoiga, the engine of the bus was happily singing "Going Home." As I opened the gate of the road to our farm, I felt such a surge of joy pour over me that I could have flown over the fields. I sat on a stone, and my eyes roved over every familiar detail of that view. In the haze of the late summer evening, it looked serene and welcoming. I was so glad to be home. That was my first experience of a deep-rooted love of the very fields of home. Every evening, my father would walk these fields, checking the animals and seeing that everything was as it should be. It was not actually necessary to do this every day, but he enjoyed walking the fields. You were never alone in them, with the farm animals and the wildlife all around you. At that time, there was a lovely practice known as blessing the crops. These were days of supplication when God was asked to bless the harvest. The farmer went to every field with a bottle of holy water, and he sprinkled the holy water and said whatever prayers he thought suitable, giving special attention to those fields in which crops were planted. I accompanied both my father and my mother as they did this, and I felt a great sense of harmony, a blending of man, nature, and God in complete unity. Chapter 20. Yalla Bacon. We killed 2 pigs every year for our household needs. On the day of the killing, my father acted as butcher and the neighbours as fellow executioners. A big timber table was scrubbed white, and beside it a timber barrel of boiling water was placed in readiness, and these were positioned outside the old, disused turf house. The pig was then led to the slaughter, but you could not say that he came like a lamb. He fought every step of the way. It took 4 strong men to hold him down on the table until my father, with the expertise born of years of practice, brought the whole drama to a speedy conclusion with his long, deadly butcher's knife. while my mother held the white enamel bucket into which the warm red blood gushed forth. When the killing was taking place, I stayed upstairs with my head under a pillow. I could not bear to see my friends meet their death. Once dead, the pigs were scalded in the barrel of boiling water, washed and shaved clean of hair. Then they were hung by the back legs from the rafters of the turf house, slit down the lengths of their bellies and their insides removed. Then my mother set to work, sorting every bit of the pig into her white enamel bath and buckets. Very little was discarded. The insides of the pig were then washed down with buckets of water that ran out the door and into the stream outside. When the cleaning was complete, 3 ash rods, peeled and pointed, were used to keep the sides apart, one at the shoulder, one at the ham, and the third in the middle. The turf house door was then shut and bolted. I used to peep in through the slits in the timber door to see the 2 white carcasses hanging in the semi-darkness, and I felt very much in awe of these ghost-like figures. They hung there for 2 days, during which time my mother was preparing skins for the puddings. First, the skins were washed and re-washed so many times that our fingers would be numb from cold water. The final washings were done in spring water from the fairy well, and this water, because it came straight from the bowels of the earth, was ice cold on even the hottest day. When the skins were snow white, they were left soaking in a bath of spring water, and looked like a nest of slithering eels. The lard was removed from the pig and rendered down in the bastable until it was clear liquid. Then it was poured into an enamel bucket, where it formed a solid block, which was used for cooking and frying. When the fat was run off, left behind in the oven were the graves, bits of gristle and meat that were embedded in the fat and would not melt, that were later minced for the puddings. My mother cooked the pig's blood and liver and many other bits and pieces that only she could identify. When everything was cooked and in readiness, filling the puddings would commence. All the meats were put in the mincer, herbs and spices were added, and once the mincing was completed, a filler was attached to the mincer. We filled white and black puddings. The basis of the black ones was the pig's blood, and the white ones minced belly meat and breadcrumbs. A huge black pot of boiling water bubbled over the fire, and as soon as each ring of pudding was complete and tied firmly, it was plunged into the boiling water. As the pudding cooked, an aromatic smell filled the kitchen. It was then lifted out of the pot using a clean handle of a brush and rested across the backs of 2 chairs where the steaming puddings gave off a mouth-watering fragrance. Row after row of puddings replaced each other on the brush handle, enough to feed an army, and, in fact, because all the neighbours got a supply, there was almost a small army to be fed. The salting of the pig took place the second night after the killing. As soon as darkness fell that night, all the neighbours came to help with the work. The backbones were removed from the pigs and they were brought into the kitchen in 4 sides of pork. First, they were cut into sections large enough for our daily needs, and then the salting began. A big jute bag of salt sat in the middle of the kitchen floor between the 2 tables on which the pigs were being salted, and we children distributed it in basins to the men who rubbed it into the meat and under the bones. Then the meat was packed between layers of salt in a big wooden barrel, which was later filled with fresh spring water. The pork steak, backbone, and some choice pieces were left free of salt. When the work was finished, the tables were scrubbed and the kitchen tidied. Then the bastable was put over the fire and filled with pork steak. The 2 tables were set for a late supper, and when the steak was golden brown, we had platefuls of it with tea and brown bread. The following day, we went around to all the neighbours with pork steak, fresh pork, and puddings, and they did likewise when they killed their pigs. We had the homemade puddings for breakfast, dinner, and supper while they lasted. The backbone roasted was a tasty dish, and the pig's ear was grilled over the open fire. Even the pig's bladder was used, seasoned up the chimney, and then pumped up to become next season's football. Every last scrap of the animal was put to use. If my mother could get away with it, she hid some of the puddings, which she hung up the chimney to be smoked. Gradually, we ate our way down that barrel of bacon. We had bacon and cabbage, bacon and turnips, and once or twice a year, when my mother decided that the iron in nettles was very good for us, we had bacon and nettles, which we ate under loud protest. The remaining bacon was taken out of the barrel and hung off the hooks in the rafters of the kitchen, where it turned a golden yellow from the smoke of the open fire. If real smoked ham was required, the bacon was hung up the chimney, which had ample accommodation in its cavernous interior. Practically all the meat we ate was produced on our own farm. My mother reared and fattened chickens, which she boiled and roasted. We also had roast duck and, on festive occasions, roast goose or turkey. Trout was a regular Sunday dish, and, as my father also liked to shoot, pheasant sometimes came our way. In the autumn, the potatoes were picked and drawn home from the field. They were then stored in the potato pit, a 6-foot-long trench that was about 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide. Buttloads of potatoes were poured into it and stacked high, and then thatched with straw to ward off the rain and frost. The turnips and mangels were treated in like manner. The turnips were for kitchen use, while the mangels, chopped up in a machine called a pulper, were fed to the horses and the pigs. The pig was the waste disposal unit of the farmyard and ate anything that came his way. Any heads of cabbage still remaining in the fields were cut and brought home to be fed to the cows because cabbage, unlike the other vegetables, could not be stored over the winter. And so the fields were cleared of crops, and when the weather got cold, the cattle were also brought in off the land, back to the farmyard, where they slept in their comfortable straw-filled houses at night and went out during the day for water and exercise in a field near the house. The turf was drawn home from the bog and built into a rick behind the house. The turf house was also filled to the door, and here what we called bruse, the broken-up sods of turf, formed on the floor over the following weeks. This bruse was used for lighting the fire, with little bits of kindling which we collected from under the trees in the groves and the fort. At the beginning of winter, a mountain of logs was stacked high beside the house. We were surrounded by trees, and when some were brought down by storms, they were cut up with a large saw called the crosscut, which was worked by 2 men. Then they were split with the sledge into wedges, and finally chopped smaller with the hatchet. I loved sitting on the pile of freshly cut logs, running my hands over the different shapes and smelling their woody fragrance. To this day, I think there is nothing as interesting to look at as a heap of newly cut logs, the delicate colouring of their veined insides telling their life story, while they wait to bring warmth and comfort. And so, a bit like the squirrel, we gathered in our stores for the winter, and if the snow came heavy and we were cut off from the outside world, we were safe and self-sufficient. Our wheat, which had been ground into flour at the mill, was now stored in bins to make white or brown bread. The timber barrel was full of meat, and eggs came from the hens daily. When God's light faded, we had the candles in the sconces and the lamp casting a soft glow around the kitchen. Facing into winter, the entire work of the farm wound down, and we looked forward to the long, leisurely nights around the fire. One of the last jobs to be done on the land was the winter ploughing. Our work was carried out in groups, but my father spent long days alone with his horses when ploughing. One winter's evening I went up in the early dusk to the field where my father was ploughing. I walked in the gap, and there across the furrows of brown earth the man, the plough, and his horses were silhouetted against the darkening sky. The last rays of the winter sun haloed these 3 in a fusion of soft light. I held my breath, afraid to intrude because I felt that I had come on a holy communion of nature, God, and man. My father, who worked with the earth, had a closeness to nature and a full acceptance of its laws and the laws of God. Years afterwards, when he was a very old man and I was visiting him, I would ask, "How are you?" And he would smile serenely and say, "Waiting." Death was as natural to him as the seasons, and he had come to terms with his God out in the fields. He was not a praying man, but he was a thinking man, and he had thought it all out right to the end. In old age he found an inner peace. It was as if, coming near the end of the road, he looked back and saw that all the turnings had led him in the one direction. Slán.